Aleatory Podcast.
I have to tell you, usually when we look at the rise and fall of empires, there is a certain grandeur we expect to find. You know, we look for the gleaming marble pillars, the glint of gold, the soaring architecture of progress. We look for the genius of inventors or the brilliant sweeping strategies of generals on horseback. But today, you and I are going to strip all of that away. We are going to look at the absolute foundation of human civilization, and I promise you, it is entirely devoid of glamour.
It really is, because underneath the marble and the gold, there is a fundamental equation that governs every society on Earth, and it is entirely biological. I mean, think of a civilization as a living organism, right?
Yeah.
When a society is small, agrarian, and tied directly to the land, there is this perfect metabolic cycle. You grow food, you consume it, and the waste returns to the exact same soil to replenish it. The cycle is closed.
But then cities happen.
Exactly. As civilizations build grand, sprawling empires, as they urbanize and industrialize, something catastrophic happens. They sever their connection to the earth. They begin dragging nutrients out of the soil to feed the exploding cities, and the waste is no longer returned to the fields. It is flushed into the rivers, washed out to the oceans. Karl Marx and the agricultural chemist Justus von Liebig called this the metabolic rift.
The metabolic rift.
Yeah, and by the mid-19th century, this rift had torn wide open. Picture Europe and North America facing a terrifying existential threat. The fields are literally dying. The soil has been drained of its life-giving nutrients. Crops are failing, and the specter of mass, catastrophic starvation is hanging over the modern industrial world. They had built the greatest machines of progress the world had ever seen, and they were about to starve to death because the ground beneath their feet was turning to dust.
Just imagine being a leader or an agriculturalist or just a desperate farmer in that era. You were looking at the collapse of everything. And then you discovered that the salvation of the modern industrial world, the very key to feeding millions of people and fueling these sprawling empires, does not lie in a new invention or a brilliant scientific breakthrough. It lies on a desolate, barren, rainless rock in the absolute middle of the ocean. A rock piled 200 feet high with the accumulated, mummified waste of seabirds. Welcome to the episode. Together we turn knowledge into real results. Today we are unpacking an exhaustive, page-by-page breakdown of a global white gold rush. We are looking at how a frenzy for seabird guano in the 19th century completely reshaped modern agriculture.
But it didn't stop there.
No, not at all. This is the story of how bird droppings birthed American overseas imperialism, sparked some of the most brutal human atrocities of the industrial age, and ignited massive, bloody wars that permanently redrew the borders of South America.
And my role here is to synthesize this massive, sprawling timeline for you. We are going to connect the biology of ocean currents and nesting birds directly to the geopolitics of the 19th century. Because you really cannot understand the borders of modern nations or the laws governing international territories without understanding this desperate global scramble for fertilizer.
We need to start at the source of this miracle. Take us to the Chincha Islands. Just geographically, ecologically, how does a rock become piled with 200 feet of bird waste?
Well, you have to look at the physics of the Pacific Humboldt Current. This is a massive, cold ocean current that flows northward along the western coast of South America, right past Peru. And because of the way the Earth rotates and the winds blow across the surface of the ocean, the surface water is pushed offshore.
Okay, so it pushes the water away from the coast.
Right. And this creates a vacuum, which draws incredibly nutrient-rich, freezing waters up from the deep ocean abyss to the surface. And where you have that level of deep-sea nutrient heading to sunlight, you get an explosion of phytoplankton. That phytoplankton feeds zooplankton, and the zooplankton feeds massive, staggering schools of anchovies.
So it's basically an infinite, all-you-can-eat buffet for marine life.
Millions upon millions of seabirds capitalized on this. Specifically, a trio of what became known as the guano birds, the Peruvian booby, the Peruvian pelican, and the Guanay cormorant. For thousands of years, these birds flocked to the Chincha Islands, which sit about 15 miles off the coast of Peru. These islands were the perfect evolutionary sanctuary. They are barren, rocky outcroppings, completely devoid of land predators.
Because foxes or wildcats can't swim 15 miles into the ocean.
Exactly. So the birds just gorged on anchovies, nested on the rocks in flocks so dense they literally darkened the sky and left their droppings. Now, in almost any other environment on Earth, bird droppings wash away with the rain. But the coastal climate of Peru is practically rainless. It is an arid desert, baked dry by the equatorial sun. So the nitrogen and phosphates in the droppings were never leached away by water. They baked into a rock-hard crust.
Just baking in the sun for centuries.
Century after century, millennium after millennium, this material just accumulated. We're talking about staggering physical depths. In some places on the Chinchas, the guano was 200 feet thick. It was a solid mountain of pure agricultural energy.
Now, let me push back on this narrative of European discovery, because the history books love to act like the 19th century West suddenly found this miracle cure for the soil out of nowhere. There were people living in South America long before the British and the Americans showed up with their cargo ships. Why did it take the Europeans so long to figure this out if indigenous populations were right there?
That is a crucial point. The pre-Incan Chincha culture, and later the Inca Empire, absolutely understood the power of guano. It was the absolute foundation of their agricultural success. The Chincha Valley supported a population of around 130,000 people, which was massive for that era in a desert environment, and it was entirely due to crop yields bolstered by guano. They used it to fertilize maize, potatoes, and cotton in the arid coastal valleys. And the Incas did not just mine it recklessly. They managed it with an incredibly strict legal and spiritual framework.
Meaning they knew it was a finite, precious resource that required ecological balance.
Oh, absolutely. Under Inca law, it was a capital offense to kill the guano birds. If you even went near the islands during the birds' breeding season and disturbed their nesting, it was a death sentence. The state assigned specific islands to specific provinces, and the extraction of the guano was heavily ritualized. It was not just a mining operation, it was a profoundly sacred act.
Wow, a sacred act to mine bird droppings.
The historical chronicles explain that before the Incas would travel to the islands to harvest the guano on their rafts, they would undergo periods of strict fasting. They would abstain from sexual relations. They approached the islands with luxury goods, food, and drink to offer in exchange for the fertilizer. They recognized that taking life-giving nutrients from the earth required a reciprocal offering. They maintained a perfect, sustainable balance with this ecosystem for centuries.
Okay, so if the Incas possessed this incredible agricultural technology and the Spanish conquered the Incas in the 16th century, how did Europe manage to ignore a mountain of miracle fertilizer for 300 years? I mean, it's right there.
Well, the Spanish conquistadors were blinded by their obsession with gold and silver. They walked right past the true wealth of the continent because it smelled like ammonia and looked like dirt. There were historical records, of course. In 1604, an English translation of a book by Father Joseph de Acosta, a Spanish Jesuit, actually described these heaps of bird dung. He wrote extensively about how indigenous peoples used it to fertilize their lands to create miraculous harvests. But Europe was not intellectually or scientifically ready to listen.
They just didn't have the science yet.
Right. They did not have the chemical framework to understand why it worked, and frankly, their own soils had not yet reached the point of total collapse. It was not until the turn of the 19th century, around 1804, that the German explorer Alexander von Humboldt brought physical samples of guano back to Europe. And even then, the scientific community had to catch up. By 1840, agricultural chemistry had finally advanced enough, thanks to figures like Alexandre Cochet and Justus von Liebig, to analyze the guano. Scientists broke it down in a laboratory and realized it was packed with nitrogen, phosphates, and potassium. It was essentially agricultural dynamite.
It's almost like the Incas treated the island like a massive, ancient server infrastructure. They understood the delicate balance. They only accessed what they needed, maintaining the whole system. And then the Europeans finally figure out the value of this data center in the 1840s, but they show up like hackers. They just want to rip the hard drives out of the walls and sell them for scrap, completely destroying the ecosystem in the process.
That is a perfect analogy. Once the West realized what guano could do, the spiritual restraint of the Inca era was entirely replaced by the absolute frenzy of 19th century industrial capitalism. By the 1840s, British and American farmers were desperate. When they field tested the guano, they found it could increase their crop yields threefold.
Threefold? That's unbelievable.
Imagine a farmer in England looking at a dying, anemic turnip field, applying a thin layer of this white dust from across the world, and suddenly having a harvest 3 times larger than their best historical year. The demand exploded overnight.
And Peru is sitting on the world's largest monopoly of this stuff. This must have been a geopolitical lottery ticket for a newly independent nation.
The Peruvian government recognized exactly what they controlled. They immediately nationalized the guano deposits. All pre-existing private claims were abolished, making the islands the exclusive sovereign resource of the state. Then they partnered with massive foreign merchant houses to handle the logistics and the global sales. The most dominant of these was a British firm called Anthony Gibbs and Sons.
Okay, so they essentially created a virtual global monopoly on high-grade fertilizer.
Exactly. And the wealth that flowed into Peru was unprecedented. From 1840 to 1870, Peru exported roughly 12 million tons of guano. That generated about 500 million US dollars at the time.
Which would be astronomical in today's currency. How did that tidal wave of capital change the country?
On paper, it initiated a golden age. Peru used this massive influx of cash to pay off the crippling debts they had incurred during their Revolutionary War of Independence against Spain. They abolished the head tax on their indigenous populations, which had been a massive burden.
Oh, wow. So it was actually doing some public good at first.
Yeah, and in a monumental and progressive move, the state actually used guano revenue to financially compensate slave owners, thereby freeing 25,000 enslaved black people. The oligarchy in Lima became fabulously wealthy. Lima transformed into the richest, most opulent city in South America. They started importing luxury goods from Paris, building incredibly ambitious, expensive railways through the Andes Mountains, and transforming their own agricultural sectors into massive cash crop plantations for cotton and sugar.
But let's talk about the maritime logistics of this operation, because getting millions of tons of bird poop from a jagged rock in the Pacific Ocean all the way to a farm in England is not a trivial task. We are talking about the age of wooden sailing ships. How do you physically move a mountain across the world?
It was an absolute nightmare of logistics. The Chincha Islands became the chaotic center of a swarming global trade network. In the 1850s, a British naval officer observed over 100 ships loading simultaneously at just one single island. There were ships from 11 different countries anchored there: the United States, England, France, the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Russia. Famous American clipper ships, legendary vessels like the Great Republic and the Red Jacket, which were built for speed and maritime prestige, were reduced to hauling manure.
I'm trying to picture the sheer sensory overload of this. The smell alone would make you reconsider your career choices.
The smell was merely the first layer of the nightmare. Guano was arguably one of the most perilous cargoes a wooden sailing ship could ever carry. First, you have the physical mechanics of the dust. Guano absorbed moisture from the sea air incredibly fast. It could take on up to 20% of its weight in water.
Wait, so the cargo gets heavier and shifts?
All right, this meant the cargo could suddenly shift unpredictably in the hold and completely destabilize the ship, causing it to capsize in a storm. Second, as this damp biological material sat in a dark, unventilated hold of a ship crossing the equator, it overheated. It produced noxious, blinding ammonia gases. It was highly flammable and incredibly difficult to extinguish once it caught fire deep inside a wooden hull.
It's basically a bomb.
And it gets worse. The microscopic dust would infiltrate and choke the ship's mechanical pumps. The alkaline chemical nature of the guano would literally dissolve the lignin in the wooden timbers of the ships, rotting them from the inside out. And it would rapidly corrode any unpainted iron fixtures. It was a toxic, suffocating, degrading substance that sickened the crews and slowly destroyed the ships carrying it.
You have these beautiful, pristine clipper ships rotting from the inside out, filled with explosive ammonia gas. But I was reading about the logistics at the islands themselves. Because of the sheer volume of ships trying to get this stuff, they could not just pull up, load the cargo, and leave. How long were these sailors actually stuck out there waiting for their turn?
The primitive infrastructure on the island simply could not keep up with the ferocious global demand. So these massive ships would arrive after a brutal journey around Cape Horn, drop their ballast rocks into the ocean, and then just sit at anchor off the steep cliffs of the Chinchas. Some ships waited for up to 8 months just for their turn to load.
8 months, anchored off a rock that smells like concentrated ammonia. How on earth did a crew of 19th century sailors pass the time waiting for nearly a year in that kind of toxic environment?
They formed a bizarre, floating micro-society. You had thousands of sailors from a dozen different nations just floating there in close proximity. They would organize massive intership boxing matches on the decks of the vessels. They held highly competitive rowing races between the crews of different nations to break the monotony. But the most surreal artifact to this agonizing waiting period is the creation of what is known as guano art.
Wait, guano art? Are you telling me they were crafting with the toxic bird poo?
Yeah, the sailors and the miners on the islands found ways to pass the time by carefully grinding up different layers of the guano. Because it had accumulated over millennia, different geological layers had slightly different mineral compositions and different colors, striking whites, deep browns, grays, and pale yellows. They would pour these different colored grains into empty glass bottles, using long wires to pack the dust down. to create remarkably intricate, highly detailed scenes and geometric designs.
That's fascinating, but also insane.
It is very similar to the sand art you might see in a beachside souvenir shop today. In fact, there is a specific artifact at the Penobscot Marine Museum in Maine from an American ship called the Henrietta that visited the islands in 1880. It is a beautifully detailed bottle, and for a long time, modern curators might mistakenly catalog these things as sand art. But the ship's historical logbook and chemical analysis proved it was pure guano.
That is incredibly macabre. Imagine bringing that home to your family in Boston. Here's a beautiful souvenir for the mantle, darling. It is highly toxic, flammable bird excrement from a rock in the Pacific.
Well, the reality gets much darker. The waiting was so agonizingly long and the environmental conditions so harsh that people routinely died just waiting their turn to load. There is a documented account of an American captain who fell ill and died while his ship was anchored off the Chinchas. His crew faced a massive logistical problem. They wanted to return his body to his family in New England, but a corpse would decompose rapidly on a months-long voyage.
So what'd they do?
To preserve his body, his crew packed him tightly into a barrel filled with dry guano, relying on the desiccating chemical properties of the bird waste to mummify their own captain for the journey home.
Let me make sure I am grasping the full picture here. Peru's oligarchy is bathing in unimaginable wealth. British and American farmers are growing record-breaking crops that are feeding millions, and a floating United Nations of profoundly bored sailors are making toxic poop art in bottles and burying their dead captains in it. But all of this wealth, all of this fertilizer requires someone to actually break the rock and move it. Who is doing the digging? How is this material actually getting off the top of a 200-foot cliff and into a ship?
Here is where we descend into the true, unforgivable horror of the metabolic rift. The extraction process was entirely manual, and it was brutal beyond modern comprehension. The cliffs of the Chincha Islands were jagged and steep. You could not just build a simple wooden dock. Miners had to use heavy iron pickaxes and shovels to physically break apart this rock-hard baked crust of ancient excrement.
Oh my God, just swinging a pickaxe into that.
The physical exertion was monstrous. They worked under the blistering equatorial sun in choking, blinding clouds of toxic, acrid yellow dust. The ammonia burned their corneas and ravaged their lungs. The caustic dust mixed with their sweat, literally burning their skin. They would load the loose guano into heavy wooden wheelbarrows, run them at a dead sprint to the absolute edge of the cliffs, and dump them down steep, precarious canvas or wooden chutes. The guano would slide roaring down the chutes into small open boats called lighters, which were violently bobbing in the treacherous surf 200 feet below. Those small boats would then row out to the massive cargo ships waiting offshore to transfer the load piece by piece.
Clearly, the wealthy elites of Lima or the British merchants sitting in London were not the ones swinging the pickaxes in the ammonia clouds. Who were the people forced into this nightmare?
After slavery was officially abolished in Peru, and the state could no longer use South American prisoners or imported Hawaiian workers due to high mortality rates, the contractors turned to a system of indentured labor. And let us be incredibly clear, this system was virtually indistinguishable from chattel slavery. The Peruvian government and their private contractors brought in an estimated 90,000 Chinese laborers, known historically by the derogatory term coolies. These men were overwhelmingly lured from the port of Macau by false promises, violently deceptive contracts, or outright kidnapping by organized criminal syndicates. Once they arrived on the Chinchas, they were entirely trapped.
What were the actual daily conditions for those 90,000 men?
It was a continuous living hell. They were forced to meet impossible daily extraction quotas, sometimes required to mine and move up to 5 tons of guano per man per day.
5 tons per person.
Yes. And if they failed to meet the quota, or if they paused from exhaustion, they were brutally flogged by heavily armed overseers wielding thick leather whips. The work was so physically agonizing, the air so toxic to breathe, and the despair so absolute that suicide became an everyday occurrence. The Chinese laborers would frequently drop their tools, run to the edge of the guano cliffs, and throw themselves onto the jagged rocks and crashing surf below just to escape the physical agony of the mines. Others would wade into the ocean and deliberately drown themselves. They were treated as entirely expendable biological cogs in the machinery of global agriculture.
That is sickening. But the exploitation didn't stop with the Chinese laborers, did it? Because I want to bring in a specific practice from the 1860s that highlights the sheer depravity of this economic boom, something called blackbirding.
From 1862 to 1863, the global demand for labor on the Guano Islands reached such a fever pitch that European and American slavers began aggressively targeting the Pacific Islanders. This horrific practice, known as blackbirding, involved heavily armed ships sailing to incredibly remote Polynesian islands. They specifically targeted places like Tuvalu, including the pristine atolls of Funafuti and Nuku'alofa, as well as Easter Island known as Rapa Nui.
And they didn't just conquer them, right? They tricked them.
The slavers would arrive and use extreme, calculated deception to capture the populations. Historical missionary reports from Tuvalu describe how the blackbirders would dress in religious clothing and promise the islanders that if they boarded the ships, they would be taught about God. Other ships promised the islanders lucrative, easy work making coconut oil on neighboring islands.
They play on their deep religious faith or their desire for economic trade to willingly get them onto the boat, and then the trap snaps shut.
Exactly. The moment the islanders were below deck, the hatches were locked. They were thrown into the dark hold and shipped directly across the Pacific to the Chincha Islands. In a terrifyingly brief period of just a few months, an estimated 3,634 Polynesians were recruited or violently kidnapped. And the mortality rate on the islands is staggering to comprehend. 93% of them died.
93%, that's annihilation.
Over 2,000 islanders perished almost immediately from disease, starvation, neglect on the rotting ships, or while toiling under the whips in Peru. The brutal physical labor, combined with their lack of immunity to continental diseases, led to catastrophic outbreaks of dysentery and smallpox. This resulted in near-total cultural and demographic annihilation for some of these fragile island communities.
Let's pause to really look at the absolute glaring hypocrisy of 19th century industrial capitalism. We are talking about the 1860s. This is the exact same era when the British Empire is fiercely patrolling the oceans with its navy, proudly proclaiming their mission to stamp out the transatlantic slave trade. This is the era of the American Civil War, a massive conflict fought ostensibly to end the institution of slavery. The industrialized West is patting itself on the back for becoming enlightened, civilized, modern nations. And yet simultaneously, they are fueling, funding, and turning a blind eye to a new, equally brutal system of forced labor and kidnapping, just so they can have cheaper fertilizer for their lawns and their turnip fields. The moral dissonance is staggering.
You are identifying the dark reality of what sociologists and economists call unequal exchange. It is the foundational pillar of ecological imperialism. The core nations, the industrialized centers like Britain and the United States, always outsource their suffering to the global periphery. They protect their own domestic soils. They legally abolish slavery within their own borders to satisfy their domestic morality. But their massive economic engines demand raw materials that can only be extracted profitably through horrific, invisible exploitation.
So the violence is just pushed out of sight.
It's pushed to a barren rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. As long as the white guano dust arrives neatly packaged on the docks of Liverpool or New York, the human cost is entirely ignored by the consumer. And we have to understand, this mania was not localized to Peru. It was a global contagion.
Right, because Peru wasn't the only place on Earth where seabirds congregated.
Off the coast of Namibia in Africa, there was a tiny, desolate rock called Ikobo Island. It is incredibly small, but because of similar ocean currents, it had a 25-foot layer of pristine guano. When the British discovered it in the 1840s, it sparked a localized white gold rush that defies belief. In a span of just 14 months, 400 ships descended on this tiny speck of land. They violently stripped 300,000 tons of guano. They literally scraped the entire island down to the bare, unforgiving bedrock.
In 14 months.
There were thousands of desperate workers living in makeshift canvas tents, fighting each other with shovels, breathing in the overwhelming stench of ammonia and decay. In just over a year, they completely annihilated the environment. They permanently ruined the bird habitat. The entire ecosystem was erased from existence.
It is the behavior of locusts. They find a miraculous resource, they exploit the labor to the point of absolute death, they scrape the earth down to the bedrock, and then they just move on to the next victim. Now, if you are an American farmer in Virginia or Ohio during this era, hearing about these mountains of fertilizer, you are not going to just sit back and let the British monopoly bleed you dry with high prices. You are going to demand your government intervene. And this economic frustration leads to a piece of legislation that fundamentally altered the destiny colony of the United States.
By the 1850s, American agriculturalists were furious. The British firm Anthony Gibbs and Sons was deliberately keeping the price of Peruvian guano artificially high to maximize their profits. The American farmers organized and heavily pressured the U.S. Congress and President Millard Fillmore to take decisive action. Fillmore actually stated in his State of the Union address that the United States should use all the means properly in its power to secure this vital fertilizer for the American people. This immense political pressure resulted in one of the most bizarre, aggressive, and consequential laws in American legal history, the Guano Islands Act of 1856.
Walk us through the actual mechanics of this act. How does a domestic law about bird poop rewrite the geopolitical posture of an entire country?
The language of the act was extraordinarily bold. It stated that any United States citizen could discover and claim any island, rock, or key anywhere in the world that contained guano, provided two conditions were met. It was not already within the lawful jurisdiction of another recognized government, and it was not currently occupied by citizens of another country. If an American citizen planted a flag and claimed it, the president had the sole discretion to consider that island as appertaining to the United States.
Appertaining, that's a specific word?
Very specific. Furthermore, the act allowed the U.S. military, specifically the heavily armed naval forces, to be deployed to protect these private claims. And to solidify control, any crimes committed on these remote islands would be treated legally as if they were committed on a U.S. merchant ship on the high seas.
So the U.S. government essentially issues a blank check hunting license for territory to its own citizens. You find the poop, you plant the flag, and the U.S. Navy brings the cannons to protect your private business venture.
Precisely. To put this into practice, in 1857, the USS St. Mary's, a heavily armed sloop of war under the command of Charles Davis, was dispatched to the Pacific with the explicit mission to protect American guano claims through the threat of overwhelming naval force. Under the sweeping authority of this act, the United States ended up claiming nearly 100 islands across the globe. We're talking about remote locations in the Pacific and the Caribbean, like Midway Atoll, Johnston Atoll, Howland Island, Baker Island, and Navassa Island.
But I want to clarify why this is such a fundamental shift in American history. The United States was already aggressively expanding, right? They were pushing west across the North American continent. The concept of manifest destiny was already a core driving ideology. Why is claiming a rock in the Pacific any different from claiming territory in the West? I mean, why does this matter so much?
Because it is a massive structural shift in the fundamental nature of the expansion. Previous United States expansion was entirely contiguous. When the U.S. expanded westward across the continent, conquering indigenous lands, the implicit and often explicit constitutional intention was that these new Western territories would eventually be fully incorporated as equal states within the Union. The people living there would eventually become citizens, and the land would be fully integrated into the constitutional framework of the Republic.
Right, they become states.
The Guano Islands Act completely shattered that paradigm. It legally allowed the United States to acquire overseas territories with absolutely zero intention of ever granting them statehood or full constitutional rights. The act even explicitly stated a provision that the U.S. was not obligated to retain possession of the islands once the guano was depleted. This was the absolute birth of America's overseas empire. It was imperialism engineered purely for resource extraction, without the burden of governance or citizenship.
Which sets up a terrifying, dystopian, legal gray area for the actual human beings working on those islands. And that legal gray area explodes into horrific violence on Navassa Island, right?
Yeah, Navassa is a tiny, brutal, uninhabited island in the Caribbean Sea, situated directly between Jamaica and Haiti. A powerful American company set up a massive guano mining operation there. By 1889, the labor conditions were essentially a flawless replication of the Chincha Islands nightmare. You had a vulnerable workforce composed entirely of Black American laborers from Baltimore. They were operating under slave-like, agonizing conditions, strictly overseen by heavily armed white bosses. The physical work was brutal, the tropical heat was lethal, the food rations were rotten, and the physical punishments for arresting were draconian.
So the workers eventually snap.
Finally, the workers reached their psychological breaking point. A massive riot broke out on the island. The workers actively rebelled against their captors, and several of the white overseers were violently killed in the uprising.
So the rebellion is crushed, the Black workers are arrested in chains, and they are brought all the way back to the United States to face trial for murder. And this is where the specific language of the Guano Islands Act gets put under a microscope by the Supreme Court.
The legal battle goes all the way to the highest court in 1890, in a landmark case known as Jones versus United States. The defense lawyer representing the Black workers, was a man named Everett J. Waring, who was a pioneering, brilliant black attorney. Waring made a fascinating and deeply logical constitutional argument. He argued that the United States courts possessed absolutely no jurisdiction to try these men for murder because Navassa Island was not legally part of the United States.
Wait, I love this argument.
If the U.S. government had explicitly stated they had no intention of making the island a state or granting its residents constitutional rights, how could the federal government simultaneously exert criminal jurisdiction to execute them?
Exactly. How can the U.S. Supreme Court rule on a murder that happened on an island that isn't legally part of the U.S.? That makes no logical sense. What is the loophole here? The act says the islands are appertaining to the United States. What does appertaining actually mean in a legal constitutional sense?
It was a highly calculated, deliberate legal fiction designed by the court to protect American corporate interests. Appertaining is a word borrowed from property law, not constitutional sovereignty. It essentially means something belongs to something else as a subordinate accessory. Justice Horace Gray wrote the unanimous opinion for the Supreme Court. The court ruled that Section 6 of the Guano Islands Act was entirely constitutional and that Navassa Island did indeed appertain to the U.S. This meant the U.S. could exert supreme executive power and criminal jurisdiction over the island as a possession, without ever incorporating it into the United States in a domestic constitutional sense.
If I am understanding the mechanics of this ruling, it is the 19th century equivalent of a massive multinational corporation establishing a shell company in a notorious offshore tax haven. They want to reap all the financial profits, extract all the physical resources, and maintain total militarized control over the asset, but they want to legally shield themselves from any liability, any labor laws, and any constitutional obligations to the workers dying to make them rich. They want the staggering wealth of an empire without the moral or legal responsibility of statehood.
That is the perfect, precise, modern analogy. The ruling in Jones versus United States was not just about bird poop. It laid the exact legal foundation for the United States to hold massive overseas territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Philippines just a few years later without granting the population's full constitutional guarantees. It legitimized the imperial concept of an unincorporated territory. Now, as a historical footnote, the public outcry over the horrific slave-like conditions on Navassa, fiercely championed by black political organizations and churches in the U.S., was so intense that President Benjamin Harrison eventually bowed to the pressure and commuted the workers' death sentences to prison time. But the legal architecture of the American empire remained permanently intact.
While the United States is quietly building the legal framework for an overseas empire via bird poop, the situation in South America is exploding into full-blown state-on-state warfare. You have massive amounts of money flowing, and that always attracts predators. We need to dissect the Chincha Islands War, which kicks off in 1864.
To understand the origins of this specific war, you have to understand the deeply bruised ego of the Spanish Empire. By the 1860s, Spain, under the rule of Queen Isabella II, is watching from across the Atlantic as its former colonies in South America grow staggeringly wealthy, particularly Peru, with its exclusive guano monopoly. Spain had never formally legally recognized Peruvian independence. The Spanish crown viewed the decades since the revolutions of the 1820s as merely a prolonged, temporary truce.
Wow, they still thought it was theirs.
Spain desperately wanted to reassert its lost colonial prestige on the global stage, and far more importantly, the Spanish treasury desperately wanted a cut of that massive guano revenue to fund its own military ambitions in Europe and Africa.
But Spain can't just sail an armada across the ocean and say, "We demand your bird poop." They need a diplomatic pretext to justify an invasion to the international community.
And they manufactured their pretext in 1863. It is known historically as the Talambo Incident. A violent brawl broke out at a remote agricultural hacienda in Peru between local Peruvian citizens and a group of Basque Spanish immigrant workers. One Spanish citizen died in the fight, and a few others were injured. It was fundamentally a localized labor dispute and a police matter, but the Spanish government deliberately blew it entirely out of proportion.
So they use a bar fight as a reason for war.
They dispatched a heavily armed naval fleet under the command of Admiral Pinzon to the coast of Peru to demand a formal national apology and massive financial reparations. And to make it a deliberate, unforgivable diplomatic insult, Spain sent their lead negotiator bearing the official title of Royal Commissary, a specific title historically used exclusively for colonial subjects, not an ambassador to an independent sovereign nation.
Which guarantees the negotiations will instantly fail. No independent nation is going to accept a diplomat who addresses them like a peasant subject.
When the Peruvian government rightfully refused to yield to this blatant extortion, the Spanish fleet struck. In April 1864, Spanish Marines launched an amphibious assault and completely seized the Chincha Islands. They violently arrested the Peruvian governor, tore down the Peruvian flag, and raised the flag of Spain. Remember, the economic scale here, the Chinchas were providing roughly 60% of the Peruvian government's entire annual revenue. Spain literally took the entire Peruvian economy hostage overnight.
How does the government in Lima react to that? You can't just lose 60% of your GDP overnight, have a foreign military occupy your most valuable asset, and maintain domestic political stability.
It caused absolute cascading political chaos in Lima. The Peruvian president, Juan Antonio Pezet, realized his domestic navy was vastly too weak to fight the modern Spanish ironclads, so he desperately tried to negotiate, vacillating and offering humiliating financial concessions to the Spanish. The Peruvian public, fiercely proud of their independence, was furious at this perceived cowardice. Pezet was overthrown in a military coup. His immediate replacement, Canseco, also hesitated to declare all-out war and was overthrown just 20 days later. Finally, a military leader named Mariano Ignacio Prado took power in a fierce nationalist coup. Prado immediately formed a sweeping military alliance with neighboring Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia to fight Spain and drive them out of the hemisphere. Let's debate the true nature of Spain's strategic mission here. Was this a genuine, calculated military attempt by Queen Isabella to physically reconquer South America and rebuild the global Spanish Empire, or was this just a sophisticated, state-sponsored mafia-style shakedown for fertilizer revenue? Geopolitically and logistically, it was almost certainly a mafia shakedown. Spain simply did not have the ground troops, the naval transport capacity, or the logistical supply lines to launch a sustained land invasion and occupy continent-sized, fiercely independent nations like Peru or Chile. It was a war of economic extortion. They believed they could blockade the major ports, hold the Guano Islands hostage, starve the South American governments of cash, and force Peru to pay a massive, crippling ransom to get their islands back. But the Spanish deeply miscalculated the resolve of their former colonies, and the strategy backfired spectacularly.
How does the naval war actually play out? Because Chile gets involved to support Peru, and from what I understand, the Chilean navy at this point is practically non-existent compared to the Spanish Armada.
It becomes a fascinating high-stakes David and Goliath naval conflict. In November 1865, at the Battle of Papudo, a small, outgunned Chilean wooden corvette called the Esmeralda used brilliant seamanship to surprise and capture the Spanish schooner Covadonga. The Chileans took the entire crew prisoner and, crucially, seized the Spanish admiral's secret war correspondence.
That is embarrassing for the Spanish.
The psychological humiliation of losing a modern warship to a vastly inferior force was so profound that the Spanish commander, Vice Admiral Pareja, locked himself in his cabin and committed suicide aboard his flagship just 2 days later.
A stunning psychological blow to the Spanish fleet.
The humiliation continued at the Battle of Antao in early 1866. The Spanish sent their heavily armored ironclads to hunt down and destroy the combined Allied fleet of Peru and Chile, which was strategically hiding in a well-protected, treacherous, shallow inlet in southern Chile. The Spanish ironclads were too heavy. They couldn't enter the shallow coastal waters without risking running aground and being destroyed. So they just sat at a frustrating distance and exchanged blind cannon fire for hours. It was entirely indecisive strategically, but it decisively proved the mighty Spanish Armada couldn't force a victory.
And when a superior military force gets frustrated by an insurgency they can't defeat, it usually leads to atrocities against civilian targets.
The new Spanish commander, Méndez Núñez, was rapidly running out of coal, food, and supplies and losing all hope of a strategic military victory. In an act of sheer vindictive frustration, he ordered his fleet to brutally bombard the completely defenseless, unfortified Chilean commercial port of Valparaiso. They shelled the civilian city relentlessly and burned 33 merchant ships in the harbor, intentionally devastating the Chilean merchant marine and local economy.
Just burning it down out of spite.
Finally, in May 1866, the Spanish fleet attempted to break the stalemate by attacking the heavily fortified Peruvian port of Callao. After a massive, deafening artillery duel where the Spanish naval guns completely failed to silence the Peruvian coastal defense batteries, the Spanish realized they could not win. They had no friendly ports to resupply coal, no regional allies, and no hope of taking the land. The Spanish fleet was forced to retreat in disgrace, and they had to sail all the way across the Pacific Ocean via the Philippines, completing a miserable circumnavigation of the globe just to get home in defeat.
So Spain is driven off, and South America remains independent. But you mentioned earlier that this extortion attempt by Spain backfired in the long term. How did a brief naval war change the balance of power on the continent?
It triggered a massive paranoid arms race. Peru and Chile realized they could never allow themselves to be vulnerable to European naval blackmail again. President Prado of Peru immediately ordered the purchase of state-of-the-art, heavily armed ironclad warships from Europe, specifically the legendary vessels Huáscar and Independencia. Chile, recognizing the vulnerability of its long coastline, began rapidly modernizing its army with European rifles and expanding its navy as well. Spain unwittingly forced its former colonies to rapidly militarize, and that intense militarization laid the deadly combustible groundwork for a much more catastrophic war just a decade later.
Which brings us to the late 1870s. The reality of extraction is setting in. The Chincha Islands guano is running out. You can only scrape a physical rock with a pickaxe for so long before you hit the bottom. But the exploding industrialized world still desperately needs fertilizer, and because of advances in chemistry and warfare, now they need something else. They need high explosives.
DuPont had recently patented a powerful new blasting powder made from nitrates. The industrial world desperately needed sodium nitrate, also known as saltpeter, to mine coal, blast railroad tunnels, and manufacture ammunition. And the largest, most concentrated deposits of caliche, the sedimentary rock containing saltpeter, were located in the Atacama Desert.
That's a brutal environment.
This is one of the driest, most brutal, unforgiving landscapes on planet Earth, and the national borders in this desolate region were incredibly murky, poorly defined, and shared by Peru, Bolivia, and Chile.
And this geographical ambiguity leads us directly into the War of the Pacific from 1879 to 1884. Let's break down the exact trigger. How does a legal dispute over a barren desert turn into a massive war that kills tens of thousands of people?
It starts with a seemingly mundane treaty and a tax dispute. In 1874, Chile and Bolivia signed a formal border treaty to ease tensions. Chile agreed to relinquish its territorial claims to certain contested regions, and in exchange, Bolivia formally promised that it would not raise taxes on the massive British-Chilean Antofagasta Nitrate and Railway Company, the ANRC, for a period of 25 years. But by 1878, the Bolivian economy is facing a severe, crippling crisis due to drought and a global depression. The Bolivian president, a military strongman named Hilarion Daza, decides to blatantly break the international treaty. He levies a new 10-cent tax per quintal on the nitrates extracted and exported by the company.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. A 10-cent tax. Tens of thousands of human beings died in a desert over a dime.
It is never just about the dime. It is about the fundamental principle of national sovereignty versus the power of massive foreign corporate investments. The ANRC, heavily backed by wealthy British capital and the political weight of the Chilean government, flatly refused to pay the tax, arguing it violated the treaty. Daza responded aggressively by threatening to legally confiscate the company's massive mining properties and auction them off to the highest bidder on February 14, 1879.
So Chile has to act.
The Chilean government recognized that they could not allow their citizens' assets and their primary economic engine to be seized by a foreign power. So on the exact day the auction was scheduled to take place, February 14th, the heavily armed Chilean military crossed the border, invaded, and militarily occupied the Bolivian port of Antofagasta.
And Peru gets dragged into this localized conflict because of a secret alliance.
Right. In 1873, recognizing the growing military threat of Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, had signed a secret, binding mutual defense pact. When Chile invaded the coast, Bolivia immediately called on Peru to honor the treaty and provide military support. Peru initially tried to mediate a peaceful diplomatic solution, but Chilean intelligence already knew about the secret defense pact. Chile issued an ultimatum, demanding Peru officially declare neutrality. When Peru refused to abandon its ally, Chile formally declared war on both nations on April 5, 1879.
How does a tiny country with a relatively small population like Chile suddenly completely dismantle two allied nations? In military strategy, there is a concept called the dime model diplomacy, information, military, economics. It is a lens to view national power. If we look through that lens, why does Chile achieve such overwhelming superiority?
It comes down to one core defining concept: unity of effort. Chile, despite some internal domestic political struggles, had a fiercely cohesive political and military strategy. Their government and military worked in absolute tandem toward a singular existential goal, securing the vital nitrate fields to ensure the economic survival of their nation. Diplomatically, they maneuvered to keep Argentina neutral, isolating the Allies. Economically, they immediately secured the sea lanes to keep their lucrative nitrate exports flowing to Europe, which continuously funded their war effort. Militarily, their navy relentlessly hunted down the Peruvian ironclads to establish total naval superiority. This is absolutely vital when fighting in a coastal desert like the Atacama, where there is no water or forage. The only way to move troops, food, and heavy artillery is by sea.
And what did the dime model look like for the Allied forces of Peru and Bolivia?
Total, catastrophic fragmentation. Peru and Bolivia were plagued by intense political instability, shifting presidencies via coups during the war, and a profound lack of military interoperability. They had no standardized rifles, meaning they had to source a dozen different types of ammunition. Worse, they fundamentally lacked a functional quartermaster corps to manage supplies, so they couldn't even supply their own troops. The logistics were an absolute disaster. In critical turning point battles in the desert, like the Battle of San Francisco and the massive Battle of Tacna, the Allied troops fought with incredible bravery, but they literally ran out of ammunition in the middle of the firefights. You cannot win a modern war if your soldiers are standing on the front lines facing charging infantry with empty rifles because the supply train was entirely mismanaged. Furthermore, after the devastating bloody defeat at Tacna in 1880, the Bolivian army essentially shattered. They withdrew high into the Andes Mountains, effectively abandoning the war and leaving Peru to face the fully modernized, victorious Chilean military entirely alone.
Which leads to a grinding, brutal conclusion for Peru.
Chile utilizes its naval superiority to launch a massive amphibious invasion near the Peruvian capital. They systematically shattered the desperate Peruvian defensive lines at Chorrillos and Miraflores in battles that resembled the carnage of the American Civil War, and physically capture the capital city of Lima in January 1881. But the war does not end with the fall of the capital. The remnants of the Peruvian army, led by fiercely defiant officers, retreat high into the Andes Mountains and launch a bitter, relentless guerrilla insurgency known as the Breña Campaign. This irregular warfare drags the conflict out for another 2 years of grueling, bloody skirmishes, ambushes, and brutal reprisals against civilians.
I want to look at the deeper geopolitical morality of this war, because there is a very prominent historical perspective that says this wasn't about a 10-cent tax or a broken border treaty at all. Former U.S. Secretary of State James G. Blaine, who investigated the diplomatic aspects of the war at the time, famously argued that this was essentially an imperialist land grab. The argument is that this war was deliberately engineered by wealthy British investors pulling the strings of a modernized Chilean military, specifically to strip disorganized, weaker neighbors of their most valuable natural resources. Is there actual historical truth to that?
The economic data following the war certainly heavily validates Blaine's suspicion. Before the war began, British investors controlled roughly 13% of the lucrative nitrate industry in the Tarapacá region of Peru. Immediately after Chile won the war and officially annexed the territory, the Chilean government, heavily urged by those exact same British investors, aggressively privatized the formerly state-owned Peruvian assets. By 1890, British corporate control of the nitrate industry in that exact same conquered region had skyrocketed to 70%. Whether the British deliberately engineered the outbreak of the war is debated by historians, but they undeniably aggressively reaped the massive financial spoils of the Chilean military victory. The war served as the violent, bloody mechanism of capitalist consolidation.
And the human cost of securing those nitrate fields is just staggering to comprehend.
Chile lost nearly 10,000 men, the vast majority not to bullets, but to disease, typhus, and dysentery in the harsh, unsanitary desert conditions. Peru and Bolivia lost between 12,000 and 18,000 soldiers, alongside massive, undocumented civilian casualties from bombardments and the guerrilla war. And the geopolitical map of South America was permanently, violently altered.
The treaties that end this nightmare are the Treaty of Ancón in 1883 with Peru, and the later 1904 formal treaty with Bolivia. What exactly happens to the borders?
Chile officially annexed the entire mineral-rich coastline. They took the Peruvian province of Tarapacá and the entire Bolivian province of Litoral. Peru lost its valuable southern territories, though the legal status of the cities of Tacna and Arica remained bitterly disputed for decades. But the most profound, devastating geopolitical consequence fell squarely on Bolivia. Bolivia was completely permanently stripped of its coastline. It became an entirely landlocked nation, cut off from the global economy.
Which brings us to the eternal ramifications of the guano age. Because losing access to the ocean isn't just a loss of physical territory for a nation, it is a profound psychological amputation.
For Bolivia, The loss of their Salida al Mar, their sovereign access to the sea, became a deep, festering national trauma that has dictated their domestic politics and foreign policy for a century and a half. Because they were hermetically sealed off from the Pacific Ocean, they became dangerously obsessed with finding an alternative route to global trade through the Atlantic. This desperation directly fueled another massive, catastrophic conflict in the 1930s, the Chaco War against Paraguay. Bolivia fought a brutal trench warfare conflict over the desolate, waterless Gran Chaco region, hoping to secure access to the Paraguay River and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean. Over 100,000 men died in that senseless war, and it all stems directly from the geopolitical scars of losing the Atacama Desert to the nitrate rush of the 1880s.
And while nations are bleeding out in the desert over these resources, what happens to the technology? Because the industrial world fights these massive wars over bird poop and natural saltpeter, but nothing in nature lasts forever.
Science relentlessly marches on, driven by capital and military necessity. As the natural guano deposits physically ran out and the Chilean nitrates became tightly monopolized and expensive, the scientific community scrambles for synthetic alternatives. Two brilliant German chemists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, eventually developed the Haber-Bosch process in 1909. They figured out the complex chemical engineering required to synthesize ammonia directly from the infinite nitrogen in the air using massive heat and pressure. Suddenly, the industrial world didn't need to sail wooden ships to mine bird excrement from remote Pacific rocks or fight bloody wars to scrape saltpeter from a South American desert. They could pull infinite fertilizer and explosives literally out of thin air.
So the industrial world gets what it wants, packs up its machinery, and just leaves the wreckage behind.
Without a single backward glance. The physical landscapes were left permanently, grotesquely scarred. The massive, towering cliffs of the Chincha Islands had been reduced to bare, carved rock. Akibo Island's entire ecosystem was annihilated. The guano age was officially over, but it left a bizarre, toxic historical footprint behind.
Like the Guano Islands Act territories that the United States claimed.
The United States quietly held on to many of those remote islands, refusing to relinquish sovereignty. Decades later, during the paranoia of the Cold War, the U.S. military looked at these isolated specks of coral they had claimed for bird poop, like Johnston Atoll, and realized their extreme isolation made them perfect for other, much darker uses. Johnston Atoll was transformed into a primary site for highly destructive atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. Later, it was used to store millions of gallons of Agent Orange and highly toxic leaking chemical weapons. The island went from a pristine evolutionary sanctuary for seabirds to a brutal guano mine to a radioactive and chemical dumping ground for the American military. The metabolic rift didn't end, it just changed its chemical signature.
I am thinking of a modern analogy to wrap our heads around this entire century of madness. The guano boom is perfectly analogous to a modern-day drug addiction. The industrial world, its agriculture, its exploding populations, its sprawling empires got addicted to a massive, cheap chemical high to feed its unnatural growth. They exhausted the natural health of their own soils, so instead of fixing their habits, they looked for a quick fix. They found it on the Chincha Islands, and they binged on it, exploiting everyone in their path until the supply was entirely gone. They didn't fix their underlying systemic issues, they just shifted to a new, more intense drug, the Atacama nitrates, and they tore nations apart, killed tens of thousands of people, and redrew the map of a continent just to secure their fix. And when the natural supply finally threatened to run out, they just went into the laboratory and engineered synthetic alternatives so the high could go on forever.
The story of guano is not a quirky historical footnote. It is the ultimate defining story of the modern world. It is the story of the metabolic rift, how human progress relentlessly demanded a brutal sacrifice from nature. To fuel the agricultural revolutions of Britain and America, the delicate ancient ecosystems of remote oceanic islands were violently annihilated. To secure the physical extraction of these resources, tens of thousands of Chinese coolies and Polynesian laborers were worked to death in conditions of unimaginable, unrecorded horror. And to control the resulting wealth, empires flexed their naval might, and South American nations fought bitter, devastating wars that dictated the geopolitical map we still use today. The staggering wealth of the modern world is built entirely on a hidden foundation of ecological extraction and human exploitation.
Think about the lawn fertilizer sitting in your garage right now, the sheer, unremarkable abundance of it. Now imagine your entire country going to war just to secure a single bag of it. It leaves you with a chilling modern parallel to consider. Because today, that exact same Atacama Desert, the one that was fought over for bird poop and nitrates in the 1880s, is currently the epicenter of a new, massive global extraction rush. Only this time, it isn't saltpeter, it is lithium. We are once again tearing up the earth, draining the fragile water tables of the desert, and maneuvering geopolitically over a new miracle resource to power our green energy transition and our batteries. You have to ask yourself, are we doomed to repeat the exact same cycle of ecological ruin, unequal exchange, and geopolitical bloodshed, just with a different chemical element on the periodic table? Thank you for giving us your time today. If this expanded your perspective, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Check the description below for reference links and more information on all the sources we analyzed today. Until next time, keep elevating your mind.
Aleatory Podcast.